Hi, Aidy Burrows here, and you're watching a chapter from the 2.8 update for the Hard Surface Modeling course in Blender. In this video, we'll be looking at Blender's Retopology options and the Polybuild tool in particular. First, a very quick definition for those completely new to the idea. Retopology is the process of creating a new cleaner mesh that's based on and wraps around an old mesh. Kind of like trying to wrap wallpaper over whatever we've created. Secondly, someone might ask what's even the point of doing retopology. Simply put, the retopologized mesh will be easier to work with, easy to animate and quicker to render. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. What we're looking at right here is just a bit of very basic scrape brush doodling in the sculpt mode, as well as a little bit of draw sharp with the stroke set to a line, enabling us to just carve in some basic panel lines. Nothing fancy at all. Switching over to object mode though, let's take a look at the wireframe of this model. We'll see there's a lot of faces there that we don't really need, and they don't really follow the curvature of the mesh that well. Our remeshing options can take us some of the way there, but usually this is where we want to break out our retopology workflow. So let's turn off our wireframe again. That's a handy one to add to the quick favorites, or maybe to a shortcut. I've got that set to the semicolon right now. And besides, as far as remeshing goes, even if we did get a really good remesh of this, generally speaking, and especially in this case, this sculpt is very rough, and so doesn't really look anywhere near as precise and machine crafted as it could. So let's see what we've got available for retopologizing some of this. Alright, so there's actually only a few things that we need to do to get started on this, to get set up. So what we need first of all is some geometry. So let's go Shift A and add in a mesh plane. Without altering the location, rotation or scale, I'm just going to keep the origin point right at the center of the world there. I'm going to tap into edit mode, and instead now we've got this face that we can scale, rotate into position wherever we want. But clearly that's not very ideal to be just moving it around like this, so we'll come to that in a second. First of all, lastly, when thinking of geometry anyway, I'm just going to jump over to the modifiers and add in a mirror modifier. Now when we're moving this, we can see what's happening on the other side of our x-axis there. That's because this rough sculpt was sculpted with the symmetry on along the x-axis. So just a quick tweak to this mirror modifier here. I don't want the geometry to kind of intersect along the center line there. So what I'm going to do is set clipping on. Just make sure merge is set as well. So now when we go to the very edge there and let go, when we move it back again, it's never going to pull away from the central mirror line. I'm going to undo that though. Just make sure our clipping and merge are still on. And that's it for geometry for now. The next thing we need is our snapping. Our snapping is up here. Currently we're set to increment, and I'd like to snap to the face instead. That gives us some extra options here. First, I'm just going to show this snapping so we can see when we press G to move it, we can hold Control, and that's going to snap onto the surface of the sculpted object there. And that's exactly what we want. Now what I'm going to do is select everything, just this plane really, with A, and then press G, and then hold Control to snap that down. And we can see the whole face coming along for the ride there. Now what I don't like about this, or what I don't want about this, is you can see the rest of the geometry isn't actually snapped onto the surface of our sculpted object. So what we're going to need to change here is to set the project individual elements to enabled. Now when we press G, hold Control to toggle our snapping there, we can see all of the points of our plane sticking to the surface. And with that, I'm just going to left click to confirm. Now one other thing is, I'd like snapping to be on all the time. So rather than toggling it with the Control key, in this case, I think it's just going to be better to enable that in the header there. Something else to think about is this option up here, also in the header, our auto merge vertices option. That's enabled at the moment, but I think by default it's probably going to be disabled. So just make sure this is on so that we can select a vertex. And if I was to double tap G to slide it all the way across there, you can see it automatically merged when it met that other vertex. So I'm going to undo that though with Control Z. And hopefully that will just save us from having to select things and go Alt M and then bring up our merge options this way. Something else to think about is it might be worthwhile adding that to our quick favorites. So right click and choose the option about here. As you can see, I've already got it on my quick favorites. So if I press Q, we can see auto merge vertices can be toggled from this area. The next thing to consider is the way that we're viewing this. So as you can see, part of this seems to be obscured. So I'm going to come over to the Object Properties tab in our Properties window and just come down to Viewport Display And then just make sure that this object is always drawn in front of any other object. And that gives us a nice clear view on that. And maybe for a better amount of clarity, perhaps we could set our color just slightly off here, just to distinguish it further from the sculpt object. And to actually see that, we're going to make sure from our viewport shading here that we're set to object. And then that is pretty much our setup complete. Now is the time to get on with the modeling. Normally, I would like to keep things on the select box, and most of these I would just use shortcut keys for, but there is the Polybuild tool that we should take a look at where that is right now. So we're going to switch to that, and you'll see immediately we get some overlays here, the blue edge that you can see there. And now that means that we're not going to be able to do a box selection, unless we press B, of course, and do it that way. But it's easy to switch back to the select box anyway by just pressing the W key. What I like about that is it's actually very, very close to the Q key for our quick favorites. So what I'd like to do is just right click on the Polybuild tool and add that to the quick favorites. So now with the Q key, we can select that from the menu there, or we can press W key to switch that back. Now I'll hit Q again just to bring up that Polybuild tool and just take a quick look at what this can actually do. So we have this blue edge here, but if we move right over one of the vertices, you can see that that turns blue, and that means that we can left click and drag and get kind of a tweak movement operation. That is actually very similar if we left click and hold onto here. It's just switching over to the tweak option there. So now we can just left click and drag and we'll be able to move those without necessarily having to press G to do it. Let's switch back again though and see what happens when we left click and drag from our blue edge. And as you can see there, we can basically very easily extrude out from our edges there. What you might be able to see is that the two vertices there are selected, so that allows us to be able to hit S for scaling or R to rotate, and if we want to reposition them slightly, we can left click and drag over the vertex there once it turns blue. Now whilst navigating around, you might have seen the red flashes there. That's just to hold shift. We can see we're either highlighting a whole face or just a vertex, and if we left click on that while holding shift, we'll delete that vertex, or if we have all of the edges highlighted of the face, we'll delete the whole face. Something else we can do is find a vertex here, and once we hold control, we're going to extrude out a triangle in some cases, but otherwise we can hold control and we'll just be able to see, if we keep our cursor quite close to that vertex, that we can actually extrude out a full quad. Now, I think currently a little bit of a limitation on this kind of method is how to merge. We can just select this vertex here if we want to merge it into that, and double tap G and slide it over, and thanks to our auto merge option, that's going to get rid of that for us. But if we were to left click and drag out an edge here, for example, and we wanted this vertex to be merged over to this one, it's not quite as precise. We can't slide it down any edge. We can't use our G to double tap our way into it. It is possible to have multiple selections on here, so we could shift select our vertex as well, and so long as we can project onto self and then toggle our snapping actually off, while we just maneuver right over that vertex there, and then once we think we're on it, we can kind of let go, and I think we got that there. But it feels a little bit imprecise, which might work in some cases. So it's definitely worth experimenting with all of this. Something else to note is that if we hold shift now, we can still get access to that central vertex there and just left click while holding shift to dissolve it. And we've created an n-gon there. All the edges related to that vertex have been dissolved. And same again there. But from here, it's not that simple to just create the necessary topology within this face just using the Polybuild tool. So this is where I would probably switch back over to the selection tool, specifically the select box, and then be just connecting up edges this way, say with the J key in that case. And again here, perhaps across there. So I'm definitely interested to see where this Polybuild tool is headed. This is definitely looking promising. But for Retopology currently, I'm actually just preferring to use the standard modeling workflow. And so just for completeness, let's take a brief look at that. So here I've just gone back to a simple quad. And now what I'd like to do is just create a surface which more neatly conforms to the general contours of our sculpt object on this piece here. So to start bringing this out, there's a couple of ways to approach it. One would be just to extrude from vertices and just create various edges, just concentrating on the wireframe really. Or we can hold control and then right click and then just sketch out the general contour that we want to follow there. And then just to select several edges here and just press F to fill the distance in between them, like here. That's definitely one way to do it. And then once we have all the wireframe that we want, we can just press F and the individual faces should get filled in for us. But I'm going to delete those with X, as I think it's probably easier to go with the general creating of faces, especially if we find our F2 add-on. Making sure that that is enabled there helps things along. For example, we can select that one vertex and press F and a face gets created from that. And it's still possible to control click to extrude in edge select mode. So I've jumped over to edges and then control and right click, control right click, and then we can scale down or rotate these into position. Now something that's important to note, if I rotate these and maybe try and find a different angle here, you can see that the geometry is no longer conforming to our snapped surface, our faces that we have it currently selected to. G for grab, however, does. So if scaling or rotating, it's probably a good habit to just nudge it slightly with G and then just let go. And now we can see both of those vertices on that edge have been put into position, but I want it shifted slightly, so I'm going to rotate that round into position there, and then because I gave a little G to move it into position, snapped it just where we needed it. As you might imagine, switching over to vertex select, double tapping G to slide does conform to the surface, so that's a safe move to do. And I think if we were to just make a little experiment, so I'll tab into object mode, select our sculpt object here, jump into sculpt mode, area. In fact, probably one of the easiest things to do is to just hop over to our grab tool, come over to the tool settings and just make it go straight up on the normal weight, and then from here I'm just going to drag a little bit of that surface out. You can see it like this. In fact, let's make a larger surface, this, and then left click and drag up. So we've got a pretty large area there that's just being obscured by our retopo mesh there. But if we jump back over to object mode, try and select our mesh. Actually, if this is sometimes difficult, we can go into the outliner, or we can just hold Alt and left click, and then we'll see there's our plane that we can easily select. Tab into edit mode, and then what I'm looking to do here is to create some geometry that goes in between these faces. So if I just shift select these two vertices and press J, you'll see these edges get created between those two vertices that we had selected, and it's all nicely connected. But as you can see, that's not really on the surface of our sculpt until we press G and then just left click and to drop them into position, and now you can see that's properly conforming to the mesh. Let's undo that a couple of times and now try the knife tool with K. I'm just going to cut from that vertex from here to here over to say in the middle of this edge and hit enter. Those vertices aren't conforming either until we press G. So with a bunch of the tools, it's worth being mindful of what we can get away with here, which is actually conforming to the surface. So let's just undo all that a few times and just know that hitting G at the end is probably the safest bet, just to make sure that we're definitely on the surface. Now that we have this edge done, I'm going to select that and hit Control and left click to get the shortest path there, and then press E and just extrude those down a bit there. Something else that we could do is Shift D to duplicate down here, and then E to extrude all this out. Now you'll see that the faces are actually facing the wrong way. So with that, I'm going to hit Control L to select the linked there, the whole face, and then I'm just going to bring up our normals menu with Alt N, and at the top we have flip. That's going to face them the right way for us. Now I'm going to shift select these two, press F, and then something that the fill command is very good at, even though we're in edge select, we can easily create some faces just by pressing F with an edge like this, and it will know to just fill in the gaps there. We could also take this edge and press B to bevel it, so we've got a little bit more going on, and then deselect with Alt A. Now I'm going to select these faces here and just delete them all. Switch over to edge select, Alt click the loop there that we've got, and then go Control F for our face menu, and then we've got grid fill, and that does a pretty good job there as well. Now as usual, I'm just going to hit G just to make sure everything snaps onto the surface there. In fact, it's probably a good idea to actually select the whole thing there and press G and just make sure all of it is nicely snapped onto that surface. And here I've just jumped forward a little bit into the process and completed several of the pieces here. You'll notice a lot of these pink lines, which are just crease marks to help with some subdivision surface modifier. So if we enable that, we'll see that all kick in. And hopefully you'll agree that this is looking much more defined and probably more machine crafted. Tabbing into edit mode, I'll just show how those creased edges are working. So if we just shift select these two and go Shift E and then -1 to cancel that, you can see that it kind of rounds out at the border. So if we just select everything with A and then go to select and then loops and then select the boundary loop, then go Shift E and then press 1. That'll put a maximum crease on all the boundary edges we had selected there, catching most of the cases where the subdivision modifier is rounding out our perimeter shape. However, I don't want things down this central line to be creased. Where it merges with the mirrored side, we want that nice and smooth and not creased. So I'm going to shift select those, and then I'm going to go Control Shift and left click that just to get the shortest path from the edge that we already had selected there, and then Shift E, -1 just to clear that and keep the central line nice and smooth. Let's take a look at this with a little bit more of a metallic look. So let's take a look at our matte caps over here, click on the icon and switch it to this one, which should give everything an overall more metallic sheen, which is looking pretty good, I think. And we can see that it's still giving it that slightly blue hue on our retopo mesh, thanks to setting to the object. Just as a quick reminder, we've got that setting down here in the object data tab, so we can kind of push that effect a little bit further if we want. Now let's just take a quick look at a few last tips. A few things it's probably worth knowing about or keeping to the foreground of the mind when operating in retopo mode. So let's tab into edit mode on this. Just make sure everything is unselected with Alt A. And then if we press Z to get into wireframe view, we can come over to this side, maybe select a bit of this. And remember, because it's mirrored, we're going to select both sides. But what we might like to do is just hide all that with H. And that might help us if, for example, we were working on the back end of the mesh. So if I press Z and then come back over to solid shading, we can see that some portions of it might be getting in the way. Let's switch it over to 3 to select our faces. Alt H would unhide everything, and Shift H would hide everything else apart from what we had selected. So again, Alt H to just bring everything back, Alt A to deselect. Now since we have our mirror modifier on, that might not be ideal because we want to still keep certain sections over on this side that we can see. And so let's take a look at the clipping plane. Now for this, what we're going to do is just draw a border of what we want to concentrate on. So let's say we just want to concentrate on this side at the back. I'm going to hit Alt B and then just draw across that area. And now we can see everything else has disappeared except the part that we wanted to take a look at. And you can see this sort of darkened area, which is kind of denoting our clipping plane. To bring everything back, we just need to press Alt B again. What I quite like about this clipping plane is that we can be working like this and then easily switch over to another workspace, and the clipping plane would be unique to this. So I could go Alt B and just clip this area, and then we can jump back over to the layout which we were on, and now we're back to this clipping plane, and then now we're back to this clipping plane. So Alt B to just clear them, pop over to the layout, and then Alt B again. Something else which is designed to help with that kind of thing, if we just tab into edit mode, I'm going to select this face here and just duplicate it with Shift D, bring it over here, turn our snapping back on, press G, rotate that around. I think we've just squished that onto the surface there. That's fine. I'm going to hit 2 and just bring this edge over here a little bit. Now as you can see, this is where our original retopologized mesh might start getting in the way. Well, I'm perfectly happy with what I can see there. That's totally fine. But let's just take a look at a few more options which can help with this. And also, I'm going to turn off the subdivision surface modifier, just so that it's clear what we've actually got. So we're missing the mirror modifier over there. So I'm just going to come up and I'm just going to enable all of these options here just to make sure we can see its effects there. And what might be useful here is to get a very clear look at what is happening on our sculpt object. Perhaps we've got lots of fine details we don't want to miss, but we want to be able to see while we retopologize. So for that, we have this hidden wire option. Now we can see we can carry on working. We can grab this edge and press E to extrude, but we can't see any of our faces. We can toggle that back on and off again just by hitting the checkbox there. That's very similar to the faces checkbox. You can see that we get a slight brightening to let us know where the faces are, and so we can toggle that on and off there. That might be something we might want to know about for clarity while working here. And one last remark about that is potentially these options might be good to have in the quick favorites. So maybe we'll just right click and add them there, and then while we're working in edit mode, and then we can hit Q, and then we might have a few decent options to help us while we work. Just to conclude, I wanted to also make mention that there are other options out there for retopology. There are some very powerful applications that will handle the job, like 3D Coat, which does a whole more than just topology actually. There's also ZBrush or ZBrush, depending on where you are in the world. That also does a whole more than just retopology. And there's also TopoGun, which is a dedicated retopology application. And talking of a dedicated application within the Blender world, checking out Blender Market, we do have a very powerful retopology option with the RetopFlow add-on. So if you know you'll be doing a lot of retopology, then this could be something that could be easily saving you a lot of time and making the process as effortless as possible. They're currently busy working on Retopology 3.0, which should be available for 2.8. For owners of prior versions, access to an early build of it should already be available. And also for up-to-the-minute details, it's worth taking a look at John Denning on Twitter, one of the core developers of the add-on, and Jonathan Williamson at CG Cookie. They're very active with it, and as it happens, it's a really good example to see just how far an add-on can actually be taken in Blender. So that should wrap us up for now on the Retopology tools. I'm Aidy Burrows, and you've been watching the 2.8 update for the hard surface modeling course in Blender.